All right, guys. So I'm trying this thing where I'm going to record my lectures on video so that you can access them at any time and ask me questions as you go through them. So I'm going to try to go quickly because you can slow my voice down. You can pause me, go back and rewatch. And I don't want the actual video to take up too much of your time. So these videos are going to have to do with the emergence of the Third Reich, specifically conditions that enabled Hitler to rise to power, and then the methods Hitler used to rise to power. So we're going to start with conditions that enabled Hitler to rise to power. And we're going to start with the first condition, the impact of war. So the war in question for the emergence of the Third Reich, the rise of Hitler, is World War I. I am not going to spend too much time on this slide, but what I want you to do in this lesson is to pause this video, go to this Google slide in Google Classroom, watch the video for the 16 or so minutes that are listed here, and then answer these questions on your own. When you are done with that, come bring me the answers to these questions and I will check for understanding. This next slide is the video in question. All right. So here is a quote from an IB website, just kind of summarizing the wrapping up of World War I. You do not need to copy this paragraph in general, but I would encourage you to read it and then summarize these two paragraphs in your own words using no more than 4 bullet points, condensing this information down in your own words. All right, so your next activity that you're going to do is watch the 13 minutes or so of the video on the next slide. It's the same video from the previous slides, but you're watching much further down. Answer these questions. Then when you're done with that, bring it to me and I will check for understanding. All right, so you do want to copy the information on this slide. You don't have to copy the picture, just the information that I've written down. So one of the first ways in which World War I had an impact on Hitler's rise to power was the way in which Germany lost the war, and more importantly, the way in which the German leaders talked about why they lost the war. So as you saw in the previous videos, Germany lost more or less fair and square. Germany itself was doing pretty badly by the end of the war, and the military leaders, especially Ludendorff, made some major mistakes that led to surrender being necessary. However, Ludendorff and Hindenburg would go on to become elected president in 1925, did not want to admit that it was their mistakes that led to Germany's loss of the war. So instead, they spread this conspiracy theory that it actually was not the German army that lost the war. The German army was doing fine. They were winning and victorious, just as the leaders had been telling their soldiers they would be. Instead, the reason why Germany was forced to surrender was because of Judeo-Bolshevik politicians back in Berlin. These people were called the November Criminals because they surrendered in November, who went behind the back of the brave German soldiers and the brave German military to seize control of Germany by surrendering and forcing the Kaiser to abdicate. This conspiracy theory has no bearing in reality. It is absolutely false, but it was a very popular conspiracy theory among veterans who could not bear the shame of having lost. They could not understand how they lost, given that their leaders kept telling them they were on the verge of a massive victory. And it was also very popular amongst conservative Germans who were much more inclined to support the military and be mistrustful of anyone in politics who might be potentially willing to sell out the country. So I'm going to show you in a minute a speech that was made by one of the leaders of the Social Democratic Party when the new republic was declared in 1918, at the end of 1918, just after armistice was signed. So I'm going to flip forward to the screen. Once I get there, pause, read it yourself, but then answer these questions and answer on paper. Once you've answered these questions, bring your answers to me and I will check for understanding. So this is the quote from Philip Scheidemann. Remember, please pause. I'm going to move on really quickly so I don't eat up a lot of time in the video. Pause, answer the questions on the previous screen on a piece of paper or in your notes. Bring it to me and I will check for understanding. So, another way in which World War I helped lead to the rise of Nazi Germany was in the way the war was settled via the Treaty of Versailles. Now, there were many treaties related to the end of World War I, relating, like, each country on the losing side had a treaty that kind of pertained to it specifically. The Treaty of Versailles specifically dealt with Germany. This treaty was supposed to be a compromise between the victors, and it really ended up being mostly from the French perspective. The French really wanted to punish Germany as much as possible, given how much damage Germany had done in France during World War One. Britain was willing to be lenient. The United States really wanted to be lenient. France pushed really, really hard for a pretty strict treaty and a pretty punishing treaty, but and they got a lot of what they wanted. So these are the main components of the Treaty of Versailles that are going to relate to Germany, the shame that they're going to feel after the war, and the anger that Hitler will be able to exploit in his speeches and in his propaganda. So copy these. These are important. This is going to make up a lot of the proposed foreign policy that Hitler is going to write about and speak about and do propaganda for. To make sure you copy these down. It is very, very important to understand how deeply shameful this was to the German people. They were a very, very proud military country who in 1914 were confident they were going to be winning this war. And now, 4 years later, well, technically 5 years later, they're not even winning the war. They're, in their eyes, being absolutely just dragged through the mud for reasons that they do not feel are fair. They were especially angry about the war guilt clause, number 9 here, that forced them to accept total blame for starting World War I. They felt this is absolutely not fair because they did not start the war. They did give Austria-Hungary a blank check when Austria-Hungary wanted to declare war on Serbia, but the conflict itself did not start with Germany, and they did not appreciate being blamed for it. So we're going to do this activity together. I'm going to go past this video, or past that link. Pause here, read this account of the Treaty of Versailles, and consider why an alternative historical perspective. Why was the treaty not as harsh as contemporary accounts made it sound like it was? So, like I said on the previous slide, to the Germans, they felt this treaty was absolutely unfair. Many Americans and American economists were very concerned about the level of harshness that this treaty was bringing to the table. Someone, I'm sorry, I forget the name of who said this, but was basically like, yeah, with this treaty, we're basically assuring that there will be a second world war just because it is so strict. However, many historians now view the Treaty of Versailles as being actually far more lenient than contemporary accounts were writing about it. So pause the video, read this account, and consider this particular historical perspective. However, here is another alternative perspective. I'll let you pause and read this yourself. I'm not going to read it for you. What I want to stress here, and this is what I put down here at the bottom, one of the reasons why World War I and the Treaty of Versailles could be considered a factor that led to Hitler's rise to power is because there were many economic problems in Germany that came about as the result of the war and specifically as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. Many of these economic problems would culminate in 1923 in the Ruhr Valley crisis. This crisis would lead the Nazis to think that this was their chance to try and overthrow the government. They would fail. However, the failure of this beer hall putsch, this attempted coup, would then allow Hitler to refocus and re-strategize and try to gain power in a more political, diplomatic way. So in this chain of events, the Treaty of Versailles is kind of like 6 degrees of separation from Hitler honing his political skills and making a more democratic appeal to the German people, which would eventually prove to be pretty successful, especially once the Great Depression breaks out. We will also discuss other ways in which the Treaty of Versailles, the devastation of World War I would lead to economic problems, which is another component, it's another theme of this curriculum. So World War I, the impact of war really cannot be separated from the economic factors in Germany prior to Hitler's rise to power. But we'll pause this video there.